Good morning. I come all the way from Washington, D.C. with a message of deep appreciation, encouragement, and unconditional love from President Trump and his administration. So thank you for the work. He wants to remind each one of us that we continue to win every day, and how evident is that here in New York when you just got a commitment for 35,000 new units of permanent supportive housing. You're winning. It's huge. It's great. And the president loves it. So I know you don't know me, so before I say a few words about who I am, I wanted to talk a little bit about my stories, because I've spent my life, frankly, advocating for homeless children and youth. So let me share a couple stories with you today. I sat on a warm sidewalk in July, eating some bean soup from a styrofoam bowl. I was 25 years old and all geeked out in my tan shorts and my plaid shirt. And she sat next to me. I didn't know if she wanted to talk, so I didn't say much. I just said hi. And after about 15 minutes, she looked at me and said, "What are you doing here?" Here was an outside food distribution program run in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It was run by a bunch of courageous, outrageous, outgoing 20-something-year-olds who would go dumpster diving and knocking on restaurant doors, collecting food so that they could feed dozens of homeless kids each night. I looked at her and said, "Well, a friend invited me. I'm a lawyer at Legal Aid." She looked exhausted and dirty, and she had cuts on her head and her face. I didn't want to look too long because I thought she would think I was staring at her. But eventually I asked her, did she like her soup? And she said, yeah. And then she just blurted out, "I'm on my own. My dad beats the shit out of me and I just couldn't take it anymore, so I left." I had no idea what to say to that, so I asked an inappropriate question. "How old are you?" 16, she said. And then there's Benjamin. Benjamin would come bounding into the classroom of the shelter with a smile on his face and come right up next to me, not really hugging me, but always kind of inching so his body could touch me. I was a tutor at our county's largest family shelter, and we had a commitment to serve the children. I would sit at a table with Benjamin, and we would do flashcards, and I would read him books, and we would do simple math together. He was 6 and rail thin. He wore shoes that were 2 sizes too big and really tattered, and he sometimes smelled of urine. He hardly talked, actually, rarely in full sentences. But what he loved was the pictures. At the end of every tutoring session, I would take a big piece of paper and I would say, "Benjamin, draw me a line or a squiggle," and he would draw something. And then I would take that picture and I would take that line and I would draw something out of that line or swiggle. A car, a truck, an ice cream cone. And then I would write at the top of it, "Benjamin," in big letters, and I would hand it back to him and I would say, "You're an artist." And he would laugh, he would love it, and he would leave every night with that drawing. And then there's my son. My husband and I took him in as a foster child when he was 13 months old. His first 7 months, however, were spent sleeping on the streets. 7th and Hennepin was his corner in downtown Minneapolis, where he hung out with his mom and dad. When he first got to foster care, he couldn't sleep in a crib. The mattress was too soft. He was used to concrete sidewalks, so his foster mom would lay him on the wood floor underneath the crib without a blanket where he would fall asleep. By the time he came to our house at age 13 months, he could sleep in a crib, but he would wake up at night screaming these terrible, howling cries with his whole body shaking, and I would come and pick him up out of his crib, and he would cling to me like he was drowning. And I would carry him to our recliner and rock him until I could feel him unfreeze, his chest collapse against mine, and I could finally hear the breathing of his sleep. And my heart would break a little each time, because as a parent, it is a terrible feeling to wonder if you're doing enough loving enough, meeting his needs enough when your baby is healing from trauma. So those are some of my stories. I have been an advocate for homeless youth, and I'll start a little bit about who I am. My name is Rich, and I grew up in a small farm community in Iowa. 800 people in the middle of a cornfield, and I went to both high school and college in Iowa and also law school. And eventually I made my way to Minneapolis, Minnesota to work at the Legal Aid Society of Minneapolis because I went to law school to work on poverty issues. And when I got to Legal Aid, a young man came up to me and said, "Oh, you're the new Legal Aid guy." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Have you ever walked the streets?" Well, I'd come from Iowa, so I said no. So he took me out. And in 3 hours, we walked around uptown and downtown and all around. And in 3 hours, we counted 30 kids sleeping on the streets in Minneapolis, Minnesota in 1992 because there wasn't enough shelter beds. And that got me angry and committed. So throughout my career at Legal Aid, I began to work more and more with family and children's issues, homelessness, poverty. But eventually, I was asked, after 8 years of litigation, to become the director of a street outreach collaborative called StreetWorks. We were a ragtag group of 25 people that hit the streets every day from 12 noon to 12 midnight trying to stop violence, sexual exploitation, and end homelessness for the young people that we worked with. It was a tremendous experience for me. While I was at this collaborative nonprofit, I wrote a state law called the Minnesota Runaway and Homeless Youth Act because at the time we realized there was no state funding for homeless kids, none. We barely survived on small federal grants and some foundation money, but there was never enough shelter beds. And if we were going to change that, we knew we had to bring this issue to the state legislature, and we did. But it took us 5 years to pass the law, of course. Legislation is never easy. And that got the attention of the National Alliance to End Homelessness. So eventually I was asked to come out to Washington, D.C. and work on children and youth issues at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and I did. But after doing that work, after 5 years, I was called back to my home state of Minnesota, and I was asked to do work at Hearth Connection. Hearth Connection is an innovative, data-driven collaborative, also a nonprofit dedicated to ending long-term homelessness in Minnesota. Our collaborative served over 1,300 people in urban, suburban, and very rural areas of Minnesota with permanent supportive housing, and that is where I cut my teeth on supportive housing. But I want to tell you a little bit about my family, too. I have a loving husband. I want to show you my kids. This is my husband and our first two adopted children. That's Diana and Dejour. We adopted them when they were 2. And we have 6 kids total that we've adopted through foster care, 2 sibling sets. The twins. The twins, and then we adopted another sibling set of 4. It has been a great and blessed journey for me. I never thought as a gay man growing up in the 80s in Iowa that I would ever be a parent. And so for me, it's a great joy. I also tell people you do not need children to be happy, but if you love children, it's a great thing. And yes, I am exhausted, and no, I don't think I've figured out parenting. But eventually, after doing child welfare work in Minnesota and Massachusetts, I was actually recruited down to the Children's Defense Fund in Washington, D.C., so that's where I am now. I serve as the National Executive Director of the Children's Defense Fund. Why am I there? Well, really for 2 reasons. Number 1, I believe in the vision of our founder and president, Marion Wright Edelman, who once said, "If America is to lead in the 21st century, we must reset our economic and moral compasses and do right by all children, all of them. God did not create 2 classes of children. The American dream did not envisage 2 classes of children, and neither should we." And I believe that every great nation deserves a great independent voice for the children. We must remember our children. There are 14.5 million children today that live in poverty, 6.5 of them in deep poverty. 17 million children experience hunger every year. 2,600 children are killed by gunshots in America. 2,000 kids in America die every year from maltreatment. Approximately 1 in 5 teenagers ages 13 to 18 experience a severe emotional or behavioral disability and rarely receive the services or the treatment they deserve. Over 400,000 kids are standing in foster care today, and of those today, 100,000 are looking for a permanent home through adoption. Still waiting, by the way, still waiting. And every year, over 100,000 kids are sent to juvenile detention, delinquency, jails. In America, children under 5 are the poorest age group. My gosh, think about that. In America, our poorest population are infants and toddlers during the years of greatest brain development. What does that say about us as a nation? Children and youth stand in the middle of every rural, suburban, and urban homeless crisis. They are yearning for stability, predictability, unconditional love, and nurturance, while a crisis swirls around them. It is at a time of critical human development that they are homeless without a home. Homelessness not only relegates children to deep poverty and want, it also socially isolates them from caring communities. I know you are all intelligent people and that you probably already know this, but I have to bear witness to my perception that our responses to homelessness have oftentimes forgotten the children. We have been too adult-focused, and we do not design homeless systems to really address the psychosocial developmental needs of children, and that must stop. So my appreciation for supportive housing began when I was an advocate for homeless children. It wasn't rocket science to me to figure out that my unaccompanied homeless youth needed both access to housing, safe housing, as well as services if they were going to do anything, become anything, achieve great things. But what I appreciated about the model of supportive housing, what really caught me, to be honest, was not just the fact of affordability, but it was this partnership, this innate respect for the participants and their innate skills. It's difficult for me to fully express this in words, so frankly I'm going to lean on a poem from Khalil Gibran. You may know this one, but I'll read it. Your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you, but not from you. And though they are with you, yet they belong not to you. You may give them your love, but not your thoughts, for they have their own thoughts. You may house their bodies, but not their souls, for their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow, which you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. You may strive to be like them, but seek not to make them like you, for life goes not backwards, nor tarries with yesterday. As a parent, one of the hardest lessons I've learned, the truth is that children are on their own path that cannot be fully shaped by us parents. And what is true for children is also true for us adults. Permanent supportive housing is based upon the foundation of self-determination. I know it's difficult to implement. I know there are challenges, and I also know that, frankly, not everyone succeeds in our programs. But it is still a beautiful thing when we tell people that their choices and free will are not a privilege, but an essential element of all human life. We offer them quality housing and supportive services today, but frankly, their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow, where we cannot join them or visit them because it's their path, their future, their dreams that we affirm through our programs. Our ability to create systems and programs and communities based on the inherent dignity of all people is really a victory for humanity, and it is the thing that continues to hook me around why this model works. It's because we don't tell people what to do. We walk with them and help them find their own paths. But I have to say, since I'm in front of a room of a bunch of experts in supportive housing, that I'm not, and I still struggle with some basic questions about this model. I wonder sometimes about these questions, and I'm just going to say them out loud before I get to other parts of my speech. One of the things I struggle with is how do we ensure in the nation that the most vulnerable, the most in need, have access to this small supply of really excellent services? My experience in Minnesota and Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. tells me that there are many jurisdictions, probably not New York, I don't know your model, but in many parts of the country, supportive housing is used, frankly, as another source of affordable housing. First in line, first gets in. There's not good assessment. And on the opposite extreme of that, I've seen in local communities where permanent supportive housing becomes almost a city on a hill with a gate around it. And we, the program people, become gatekeepers where we allow our biases in. And I think there's unresolved tension between our ability to use it just as another source of affordable housing and our ability not to be gatekeepers that keep people out. Another question I have is, how do we really end social isolation? So I think this is one of the great perplexities for me as a homeless advocate and as a child advocate, because I believe that one of the greatest harms that people experience is actually through social isolation. I think in Minnesota, now this is in Minnesota again, my experience, when we talked about ending social isolation and when we talked about community building, what we, the white, upper middle class people really meant was that they were supposed to find their own people to build community with. I don't think we really meant it in an inclusive way. What does it really mean for us to erect programs to end social isolation when most supportive housing professionals where I came from chose not to live in locations that had concentration of affordable housing? They excluded themselves. So I think we have to think about that. What does it mean to be in an inclusive society, and how do we do that better? And the last question I have about supportive housing that I've never been able to really get a handle on is, how do we measure success? I once had a board member who once told me, well, you talk about stability in housing, right? You have all this stability in housing, but that's easy to achieve when you're throwing free housing at people and a lot of services. We have to do something more. We have to transform lives. That may be true, that may be lofty, but what does that really mean? And who defines transformation? Is it our goals for them or their goals for themselves? And how do we figure out that measure? I think we have to really deal with this, though, because we have a tension between how we as a community may view success in ending homelessness, the fact that we're simply getting people off the streets and out of harm's way and into a stable home, and how the society or funders may wish us to do something more, something different. I don't expect us to have a discussion today, but I'd love to have coffee with you guys if you want to have discussions later about that. But I don't want to just dwell on these questions either, because frankly, I must admit, we're in for a challenge. Just as many of the speakers have said today, it is 2017 and there is an election, and we are up against unprecedented times. I don't think I can address you today if I don't admit the fact that we are in a deeply divided and conflicted culture. I don't need a crystal ball, frankly. For the last 4 years, I have seen what the majority plan in Congress is. They've been very clear. And I have to tell you as an audience that if you don't understand the magnitude of what we're facing today, we will be ill-prepared, ill-equipped to actually do anything positive for children. So here is the roadmap. It's repeal the Affordable Care Act, deny access to health care. It is tax reform with the largest benefits to the upper 1% to 5% of American millionaires. It is deregulation of the financial services industry, that's banks and investment firms. And it's devolution of federal financial assistance to the needy. We're going to block grant financial assistance to the states, and then over a decade, we're going to actually cut those benefits. The proposals being considered by Congress will result in 2 major harms. It will harm struggling children and place insurmountable barriers and challenges on state and local budgets, and it will concentrate more wealth with the top tier of this nation. Under the majority's plan in 2015, they plan to cut $150 billion from domestic programs over the next 10 years. That's 25% of the entire federal budget for domestic programs. And they expect the local community, frankly, to pick it up. This is what it looks like. The federal budget. All the little tiny triangles are the ones I care about. And what they're trying to do is increase the military by $55 billion at the expense of domestic programs. And yes, Trump's budget is disastrous for children, and yes, you should be calling your senators and your representatives to talk about the fact that it is not what we see for ourselves as a vision. But if you think, and if I think that the target is Trump's budget, we have it wrong, because Trump's budget is already dead in the water in Congress, and we have to keep our eye on the ball. It is the congressional agenda that we must be aware of, and it is that attempt that we must be most vigilant, because their attempt is to actually rewrite the entire federal framework, dismantle federal assistance to low-income people, scale back on human rights, transfer wealth. Banks and also to federal spending would be focused only on military and not on domestic programs. It is a rewriting of the balance between federal government and local communities. But this is not our first rodeo. And by the way, this is another slide. It shows kind of President Trump's how the budget is actually doing again. But this is going to make it easy. It's going to make it easy for the majority in Congress to say, well, at least we didn't do Trump's cuts. We're just going to do something else. And that something else is dismantling the federal government. But this is not our first rodeo. And what drives me into dark corners is that there was actually a spiritual leader among us 50 years ago who gave us a roadmap about just this sort of thing. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke to Riverside Church here in New York City in 1967, a year before he was killed. And what he said was that we were making grave mistakes that were jeopardizing our democracy and our civil society. During his remarks regarding the Vietnam War, he said the following: "A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triad of racism, extreme militarism, and materialism are incapable of being conquered." And here we are again, 2017, 50 years later, and we're back to the same thing. Miriam Wright Edelman would stop us here and to remind us of a truth that we must be willing to repeat back to our friends, our families, and our coworkers over and over again, that the greatest threat to the United States does not come from an outside entity or a foreign source. It comes from our inability, our failure to make investments in the health, education, and well-being of children. But we cannot be frozen in despair or anger. Even at a time like this, we have to show up. I return again to the words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King in his speech at Riverside Church when he said, in response to criticism that he was talking about Vietnam when he should be really talking about civil rights, he said, "A time comes when silence is betrayal." The truth of these words is beyond doubt, but the mission to which they call us is a most difficult one. When the issues at hand seem as perplexing as they often do, we are always on the verge of being mesmerized by uncertainty. But we must move on, he said. This mess of a divided blue and red nation and the election of 2016 has presented us with awful complexities. How do we find middle ground? How do we find solutions when our approaches and our core beliefs are so radically different? Dr. King would say that we cannot be mesmerized by the uncertainty, that we must move on. We must move on in love, and we must commit ourselves to nonviolent direct action. So here I am today asking you to be here for the children, and I need you to do three things: confront the narrative, focus on solutions, and keep showing up. So confronting the narrative. We must confront the narrative, the paradigm narrative. This is their attempt, the mainstream's attempt, the people in power's attempt to define reality by repeating a statement over and over again until people believe it. But the narrative is not facts. Government doesn't work. War on poverty has failed. Local control is always better. Our country is now post-racial. Color doesn't matter. Refugees and immigrants are a threat, especially the brown and Muslim ones. Poverty is worse. Law and order is the answer. But confronting the narrative doesn't mean demonizing, belittling, or isolating those that disagree with us. It frankly begins with the hard work of listening, talking, and building relationships to shape minds and hearts. If we really think we're going to get out of this conflict, out of this divide, it has to be not through isolation, but by actually stepping up to be in dialogue. The Americans who voted for this administration have two primary fears. One, that they are being left behind in the American dream and that no one is listening or doing anything. And two, that their children are inheriting a nation which does not guarantee them a better quality of life. Listen to those fears. There are kernels of truth in the things that they are saying that we must at least validate. But we have to confront their solutions. Their solution is the devolution of government, civic institutions, and an attempt to turn social crisis issues over to local charitable and religious groups. That is a disastrous plan for children. For we know what that experiment brought us. We did it for most of the 18th and 19th centuries here in the United States with a weak federal government and local charity councils. And what we got was grinding child poverty and death, public pandemics, segregation and racial violence, orphanages and county homes with cesspools of exploitation and abuse, mental health institutions with medieval torture techniques, lynchings, denial of basic needs for those deemed unworthy, hunger, Jim Crow, genocide against the American Indian population, and ghettos sprawling with immigration. Local control is not the answer to our greatest challenges. Local communities, faith-based groups, and family foundations can be wonderful and impactful institutions, but they have never been able to significantly address child poverty, want, or the growing inequalities in our society. My great-grandparents and grandparents' generations began a progressive reform agenda. They shut down the orphanages, they reformed social services, they invested in public education, they closed the county homes, they began to deliver community-based services, and they demanded that government have a role to address hunger, to house people, to address medical, behavioral, and mental health needs, to find clean water, to educate all children, and to ensure our safety and well-being. We must never go back because progress is a part of our birthright here in America. Red and blue, however, we must begin to draw a line around the well-being of children in our policies. Policies should do no harm. The next thing I need us to do is focus on solutions, because it's really in the ideas and solutions that we move hearts and minds as well. And we know so much about solutions. We actually have ideas on how to end child poverty, or at least to ameliorate it to a great degree. You can go to my website at the Children's Defense Fund to find a report on that. But we also have to invest in affordable housing, especially rental housing in rural and urban communities. We have to target resources to those most in deepest need. We have to ensure access to primary mental health and addiction services. And we must demand evaluation and accountability amongst each other. That means that we have to have data and we have to have information. As nonprofit organizations and entities and community organizations, it is no longer good enough to put out the big number. We serve 5,000 people. What does that mean? You serve 5,000 people. What do you accomplish? And it's no longer good enough to have the one sympathetic, persuasive story. I took Sarah at the age of 18. She was a homeless kid, and we took her to college, and now she's a Harvard medical graduate student doing doctor work. Well, that's great. What did you do for the other 499 people that you served? We have to be real about accountability, and we have to hold each other accountable as well. And the last thing I'd say is that we have to keep showing up. I have one last story to share. In my late 20s, my aunt, Doris Schlotterbeck, got very sick and almost died in the hospital, but she recovered. And that summer, my family decided to all go together with our cousins to a lake to go fishing for a couple of days. And when we got to the lake, my mom asked me to take my aunt out for a boat ride because she loved the water and she loved to look around. And so I took her out. It was just me and Aunt Doris. And about halfway around the lake, I looked at her and I said, "Aunt Doris, Mom said you almost died in the hospital." And Aunt Doris said, "Oh, yes, it was awful. I almost died. I was in so much pain and I was so weak, and I would pray every night that I would just be taken." And I said, "What was that like? What was it that turned it around? How did you recover?" And Aunt Doris said, "Yeah, it was dark. But you know what did it?" And I thought, here it comes, the life lesson, the part where she sees the light, finds God, digs deep into some spiritual well and climbs out, finds her reservoir. And I thought, give it to me, Aunt Doris. And she said, "Well, I woke up every day. I thought it was the end, but then I would wake up. I just woke up every single day." So that's my takeaway, folks. We just got to wake up. We got to wake up, we got to get up, and we got to show up for kids. But here's the hard part. Here's the hard part. It's not about showing up one day. It's not about a rally or a march or an initiative or a campaign or a conference. This is a lifetime of waking up and showing up. It is a movement of social justice, a movement of love, a movement of holding people accountable and finding hope for ourselves, and it is about continual vigilance. If you don't wake up each morning and commit yourselves to making the community a better place, to service to others and providing love to the children around us, then we will never become the beloved community or reach the ideal of America. We have to keep showing up and waking up, and we have to keep listening and discussing and building relationships and being positive seekers of love and justice, and we have to show outcomes. Finally, as we face the challenges ahead in 2017, I want to share a poem from Lynn Unger's Bread and Other Miracles that has meant a lot to me this year. "Breathe," said the wind. "How can I breathe at a time like this when the air is full of smoke, of burning tires, burning lives?" "Just breathe," the wind said. "Easy for you to say if the weight of injustice is not wrapped around your throat, cutting off all air. I need you to breathe. I need you to breathe. Don't tell me to be calm when there's so many reasons to be angry, so much cause for despair. I didn't say be calm," said the wind. "I said to breathe. We're going to need a lot of air to make this hurricane together." So thank you to your work and to the Supportive Housing Network of New York for everything that you do every day and for showing up today to make a difference. Thank you for inviting me. I've been honored to be here, and I wish you every blessing and good work. Thank you.